My name is Elaine Mercer. I'm 38 years old, and for 15 years, I built my career on the premise that ancient gods were dead. Beautiful, yes. Culturally significant, absolutely. But dead, artifacts of civilizations that no longer existed, symbols stripped of power the moment the last temple fell. I had a PhD in art history and a specialization in ancient religious iconography. I had published work on Egyptian symbolism in contemporary fashion. I had sat in university lecture halls and explained to students why the Eye of Horus was an aesthetic motif, not a spiritual reality. I was the expert. I was the person people called when they wanted intelligent analysis of why a celebrity wore Isis wings at the Met Gala. And I am now the person telling you that I was catastrophically wrong, not about the history, about what I was looking at. I need you to understand who I was before I tell you what happened to me. Because if I had heard this story from someone else, from a televangelist, from a conspiracy channel, from anyone without my academic credentials, I would have dismissed it in 30 seconds. The version of me that existed before that night would have called this exactly what it looks like. A religiously motivated misinterpretation of cultural phenomena dressed up as divine revelation. I spent 15 years talking that way. So when I tell you that Jesus Christ took me out of my body and showed me the spiritual reality behind the symbols I had been cataloging my entire career, I need you to hear it from the woman who would have been most skeptical of that claim. That woman is the one telling you it happened. I loved the Met Gala. Every year, I looked forward to it not for the spectacle, but for the iconography. When celebrities arrived in Isis headdresses, in serpent jewelry, in celestial crowns, I pulled up my research files and cross-referenced. I published pieces for cultural magazines. I gave interviews. I treated the whole thing as an enormous, involuntary art history exhibit happening in real time. I also called myself a Christian, raised in a faith household, believing in God at a comfortable intellectual distance. The two rooms of my life, faith and scholarship, carefully maintained as separate spaces. I could study Isis and Osiris in one room and pray in another without those rooms ever touching. I was, I thought, sophisticated enough to hold both. What I didn't know was that the sophistication I was so proud of was the very thing that made me blind. The person who understood those symbols most deeply was the person most thoroughly trapped by the assumption that understanding them academically meant understanding them completely. I was 38 when my heart stopped on a Thursday evening. No warning, no prior cardiac history. Nothing in my medical record that predicted it. Somewhere between sitting on my couch with a glass of water and the next moment, I was on the floor and I was not conscious. The paramedics were called. The emergency team worked for 11 minutes. 11 minutes is a very specific number, and I want you to hold it, because what I am about to tell you is what happened inside those 11 minutes. Not after them. During them, when by every clinical measure available, I was not alive. The first thing I remember is silence, not the absence of sound, something more complete than that. A silence that felt like it had weight and texture and intention. I was somewhere with no physical coordinates I can give you, and I experienced only the silence and an overwhelming sense that I had arrived somewhere I had always been heading toward without knowing it. Then I was above a room. The room was the interior of an ambulance, and the people in it were working on a body, and the body was mine. I could see the color of the floor panels. I could hear a voice saying numbers, heart rate, time elapsed. I noticed, with the detached clarity of someone watching a film, that the person doing compressions had his left shoelace untied. Details I could not have known. Details I later confirmed. The body on the stretcher was not me. I was above it, and I was more awake than I had ever been in my life. I did not drift toward a tunnel. What happened was something for which I do not have adequate language. And that in itself is evidence, because I have spent my career working with language, and this thing defeated it. There was a recognition. Something ahead of me already knew me. Not knew of me. Knew me. Every interior thing I had never said aloud, every private fear, every version of myself I had carefully kept behind closed doors. All of it was known, and the knowing was not accusatory. It was like a parent recognizing a child they have been waiting for. That recognition drew me forward, and I went toward it the way you move toward warmth when you have been cold for a very long time. I cannot tell you what he looked like in the way you might want me to. There was no bearded figure in white robes. What I encountered was a presence of authority and love so complete and so simultaneous that the combination was unlike anything I have a category for. Authority alone is cold. Love alone can be weak. What I was in the presence of was both at their absolute maximum intensity, operating at the same time, and that combination told me, without ambiguity, without introduction, exactly who this was. I knew him the way you know your own name, not from pictures, not from church, from something older than either of those things. I was not frightened of him, not for a single moment. I was undone by him. Those are different things. He looked at me with a love I had no framework for, and the first thing he said to me was not about my life, not about my choices, not about judgment. His first words were about the thing I had spent my entire career studying. He said, "Let me show you what they worship." And then the visions began. I had no framework for what I was about to be shown. Every category I had built over 15 years of scholarship dissolved in the space of a single breath. I was in Egypt, not the Egypt of textbooks or museum exhibits or the photographs I had used in my lectures. I was in Egypt as a living place. The heat, the sound, the smell of incense and stone, and something else underneath those things I can only describe as a frequency of devotion. There were priests and temples and a ritual in operation that had the quality of something utterly practiced, utterly familiar. And I could perceive, not just see but perceive, what was being honored. Not a statue, not a concept. Something was receiving that devotion. Something that wanted it. Something that consumed it the way a fire consumes fuel. As it received that devotion, it grew, and in growing extended its reach further into the lives of the people doing the honoring. I was not watching mythology. My entire career was built on the premise that I was watching dead history. What I was perceiving in that vision was a spiritual transaction, something real receiving something real. And then Egypt became Babylon. The transition was like turning a page in a book that contains the same story written in different languages. Babylon had different names for the same forces. Ishtar, where Egypt had Isis. Different temples, different rituals, different aesthetics, and the same thing underneath, the same signature. And this is the moment my academic mind did something that had never happened to it before. It seized. Because what I was trained to understand as cultural diffusion, the movement of religious motifs from civilization to civilization through trade and conquest, I was now perceiving as something else entirely. These were not different religions. This was one system, one set of forces wearing whatever name and face the local population would accept, making the same offer in every language. The offer was always the same: wisdom, beauty, power, secret knowledge. The price was always the same: worship, devotion, the elevation of these forces above everything else. Specifically, above the presence I was standing in. That specificity was not lost on me. Babylon became Greece. The names changed again. Isis became Aphrodite, became Astarte, became a dozen variations of the same promise dressed in different cultural clothing, and the signature remained identical. I could feel the sameness, the way you can feel the same piece of music in different keys, transposed but recognizable. Greece became Rome, Venus, Minerva. And I want to pause here because this is the thing that broke my academic framework completely. I had spent my entire career teaching students that these were separate religions with shared motifs, evidence of cultural exchange, of human beings borrowing what worked from their neighbors. What I was perceiving in those visions was something categorically different. Not borrowing. Continuation. Through all of it, across every civilization and every name change, one continuous operation, one system, 5,000 years old and completely unbroken. The trap, and that is the word that arrived in my understanding fully formed in that place, was not crude. It was not evil the way a horror film is evil. It was elegant. These forces understood something fundamental about human desire. People do not pursue things they believe are bad for them. People pursue things that look like wisdom, like beauty, like power, like enlightenment. The most effective cage is the one the prisoner believes is a library. That is what I was being shown. A 5,000-year-old library that was actually a cage, and the books inside were written by the jailer. Jesus did not tell me the system ended with the fall of Rome. He showed me what came next. The visions moved forward through time. I watched the same symbols migrate through medieval Europe, through courts and secret societies, through esoteric traditions that preserved ancient iconography under new names. Alchemy, Hermeticism. The eye that had watched from Egyptian temple walls, still watching. The serpent, unmistakably the same serpent. The celestial crowns and sacred feminine figures that were Isis in one century and something else in the next, but never stopped being what they were. The system did not hide. It adapted. It learned the aesthetic vocabulary of each new era and dressed itself accordingly. By the time the 20th century arrived, it had something it had never had before: mass media. A way to place its symbols in front of every human being on the planet simultaneously. And then I saw the red carpet. He showed me a vision I recognized immediately, the specific visual grammar of a major entertainment awards event. The kind of event I had watched every year with my glass of wine and my academic detachment. I saw celebrities in Isis headdresses. I saw the Eye of Horus rendered in diamonds and draped around the necks of people who had no idea what they were wearing. I saw the serpent wrapped around bodies and displayed before cameras broadcasting those images to millions at home. I saw celestial imagery, deity iconography, the specific visual language of ancient temple worship translated into haute couture and celebrated as fashion. The flashes captured it. The crowds applauded. And the millions watching from home sent their attention, their admiration, their fascination to those images. What I understood in that moment, with a clarity that hit me like a physical impact, was that admiration is a form of devotion and attention is a form of worship. And the system that had been operating for 5,000 years had found the most efficient worship engine in human history: entertainment. I am not telling you the people in those outfits were evil. That is not what I was shown. I was shown a mechanism, not a conspiracy. The celebrities on that red carpet were not initiates of an ancient cult. Most of them chose those outfits because they were beautiful, because a talented designer created them, because the theme called for ancient deity references, and that seemed interesting and sophisticated. That is precisely how the mechanism works. You do not need the participants to be aware. You only need the symbols to be present and the attention to flow. The devotion moves the same way whether the person giving it knows what they're giving it to or not. I know what I saw. After the modern vision, he spoke to me. Not with words the way words work here, sound arranged in sequence, meaning assembled from grammar. It was meaning arriving complete. And what he communicated was not anger, not condemnation of the people in those images, or of the culture that produced them, or of me, who had spent 15 years studying those symbols and writing about them admiringly. What he felt, and I could feel what he felt, was grief. The grief of someone watching people they love walk through a door they cannot see. He was specific about the nature of the trap. The most dangerous entry point is not fear. The most dangerous entry point is fascination. You cannot protect yourself against something you find beautiful and interesting and culturally enriching. You cannot be suspicious of something that arrives looking like art. The door that looks like a library is the door that will let anything in, because you have decided in advance that libraries are safe. He was telling me, and I believe he was telling me to tell you, that looking more carefully at what you find beautiful is not paranoia. It is discernment. Discernment is not fear. Discernment is vision. It is the capacity to see what a thing actually is rather than what it presents itself as. He told me something that has stayed with me most completely. The thing this system cannot survive is a person who has a genuine relationship with him. Not a religion, not a theological framework, a relationship. Because a person in relationship with the real thing cannot be deceived by the counterfeit for long. The counterfeit can fascinate, it can temporarily seduce, but it cannot satisfy what only the real thing can satisfy, and sooner or later, the absence becomes detectable. The system's only defense is to keep people too entertained, too busy, too aesthetically stimulated to notice they are hungry. I came back to my body the way you fall into cold water. Sudden, gasping, every sensation at once. The flat ceiling of what I later learned was an emergency room. The smell of antiseptic. The cold brightness of fluorescent lights, a nurse saying my name, hands on my arms. I was back, and the world I was back in felt like exactly what it was. A lesser version of where I had just been. Flatter. Less real than what I had just experienced, though everything around me was technically the real world. And what I had just left, by every definition I had built my career on, was not. I did not speak about what I had seen for several days, not from trauma. I was silent because I did not yet have language that fit. Every sentence I tried to form came out wrong, too small, too flat, carrying none of the dimensional weight of what had actually happened. I tried to explain it to the hospital chaplain on my third day, and I watched his face move through confusion, and then professional compassion, and then the careful expression people adopt when they are being kind to someone they are not sure is entirely well. I stopped trying to explain it. I lay in that hospital bed and held what I had seen, and I knew that when I was able to speak about it, it would not be because the words had gotten better. It would be because the urgency had gotten too large to contain. I left academia 8 months later, quietly, with careful professional language and a genuine sense that the person who had held that position no longer existed in the form required to continue holding it. My relationship with faith is no longer 2 rooms. It is 1 room with no ceiling, which is the only way I know to describe what happens when the wall between what you study and what you believe ceases to exist because you have stood in the presence of the thing you were studying. What I see now when I look at fashion editorials, at entertainment award ceremonies, at museum exhibits celebrating ancient deity aesthetics, it is different. Not alarming, not conspiratorial, just clear. I can see the system doing what it has always done, wearing the clothes of each new era. And I can also see the thing that is more powerful than the system, which is what he showed me exists on the other side of all of it. He asked me to tell people, not to generate fear. To tell what I was shown by someone who spent a career convinced she understood those symbols completely and discovered 11 minutes into clinical death that she had been cataloging the surface of something she had never once looked at directly. The symbols are not dead. The forces behind them are not myths. And the man who took me through those visions loves you, specifically and without condition, in a way that makes every other version of love feel like a rough draft. If any part of what I've told you today has unsettled something in you, trust that. That unsettling is not fear. It is the beginning of seeing. And if you want to go deeper into what the spiritual reality behind these ancient systems actually means for your life, watch the next video. Because what I was shown about how these forces enter ordinary lives, not through temples and priests, but through the small daily doors of fascination and habit, is more relevant to where you are right now than anything else I've ever studied.